I'm Caleb Bissinger, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, as close to time travel as we will ever get. We have an unwritten rule here on the show. It says that in the summertime, we have permission to make episodes that are on the quirky side. This is one of those episodes. A few weeks ago, I got my hands on an early copy of a new book by Sam Keen. Sam is a science writer whose other books include The Disappearing Spoon, which is about the periodic table, and The Violinist's Thumbs, which is about DNA. Seemingly dull topics, but that Sam manages to make funny, entertaining, in the words of the New York Times, ebullient. His new book is no exception. It's called Dinner with King Tut: How Rogue Archeologists Are Recreating the Sights, Sounds, Smells, and Tastes of Lost Civilizations. As soon as I read that title, I knew I wanted to apply the summer rule and get Sam on the show. To write the book, he traveled all over the world, hanging out with experimental archaeologists. I'd never heard of this field before, but picture a merry, if slightly unhinged band of academics and amateurs who aren't content to just dig up artifacts and theorize about them. These experimental archaeologists are doers. They brew ancient beer, make mummies, build catapults, all in an effort to resurrect the past so that they might learn in a sensory-rich way new things about how our ancestors lived and also about our own humanity. Artifacts sitting on a shelf, Sam says, can only take us so far into the minds of other people. To reach them on that deeper level, he writes, we need to inhabit their world, to touch and smell and taste everything they took for granted. We need to feel the fabric of their lives. And experimental archaeology can do that in a way that no other field can. My conversation with Sam Keen when we come back. Sam Keen, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Your new book, Dinner with King Tut, opens with a confession. You say you've always had a gripe with archaeology. What's going on? What's your beef?
So I really love archaeology in that you get to learn the deepest things about human beings. You really grapple with some big, meaty questions about who we are, where we came from, how we spread across the globe. And I really love learning about and grappling with those big ideas. But every time I would go to an actual archaeological site, it just looked so boring to me because it was just a bunch of people sitting around in the dirt with little dental picks or toothbrushes or whatever, brushing off little pod shards. Day after day, week after week, every site around the world looked exactly the same, and it just looked so tedious to me. So there was this big disconnect between the big questions that archaeology gets at and can answer and the day-to-day work of the field.
Okay, so enter experimental archaeology. This becomes your antidote to that traditional, boring archaeology. Define it for us. What is experimental archaeology?
Basically, experimental archaeologists are making and doing things. They're trying to recreate the past in different ways. Sometimes they're trying to recreate lost recipes, make ancient food. Sometimes they're trying to make ancient tools, stone tools or wooden tools, things like that. Sometimes they think bigger and they're trying to make, giant catapults like they had in medieval times, or building ancient boats and setting sail on those. At different points in the book, I got to attend an authentic Roman banquet. I did get to see a giant catapult, like a 30-foot tall medieval catapult, and we spent a day shooting these giant garden stones around, which was pretty fun. I got to try my hand at ancient surgery, ancient tattooing, eat some amazing things. So it really brought the field alive and made it a lot more sensory rich than you get in regular archaeology, sort of dirt archaeology.
Yeah, I mean, you refer to it other times as living archaeology. I was sort of thinking about it as I read as participatory archaeology.
Yeah.
But really, it's time travel, isn't it?
Yeah, that's how I look at it. It's probably as close to time travel as we will ever get, at least in our lifetimes, because you really do get to go back and experience things the way that people did. You get to smell and taste things. You get to hear things. You get to touch things. It really puts you in that time and place and also kind of in the mindset of the people because you're going through the same processes and experiences that they did. You get to experience the joy when things work right or often the frustration when they don't go right.
And you write that under the tutelage of these experimental archaeologists, you, quote, made a DIY mummy, fired a giant catapult, you alluded to that a moment ago, even tattooed someone. You say, I've eaten guinea pig, llama, caterpillar, whale, and walrus. I've been spattered with urine, blood, blubber oil, and worse in countries all over the globe. I loved every second of it. Did you really, though? Did you really love every second of this? Because some of that sounds pretty gross.
That stuff was a little bit gross. It was at least interesting, though, and it was over pretty quickly. There were a few things I did that I admit I got pretty frustrated with just because they were very long, difficult processes. A couple of them come to mind, especially tanning things. I tanned a deer hide, and doing the ancient surgery were long, frustrating. I was out in the middle of a field. It was very hot out. There were flies all over. They started biting me. It was really, really frustrating. But I think that emotion was part of the process because it does, again, put you in the mind of people way back when. And, if you wanted to make a leather hide for clothing or something, there wasn't a shortcut. You couldn't go buy one. You had to go through the process of doing that. Or if you were a medicine person trying to save someone's life with this surgery, you couldn't just quit or take them to a hospital or something. You had to go through this process. So it made me appreciate the persistence and the amount of frustration they were willing to put up with back then. And also to appreciate the fact that they did it at all because we wouldn't be here if they had not gone through and endured those frustrations.
You've mentioned a few times ancient surgery, and I think our listeners are probably getting terrified about the fact that you are out there potentially operating on people. You're talking about trepanation, I think, here. Describe what that is and talk about what you did.
So trepanation is, they think, the oldest surgery that we know of. It's a skull surgery. So basically what you're doing is you're removing a piece of the skull. Maybe someone, you're in a battle or something and someone brought an axe down and hit you in the head. Maybe you fell from a high place, smashed your skull in, it's kind of cratered in, pressing on your brain. Maybe you had an aneurysm, there's blood pooling up. So basically you're removing a piece of the skull to relieve the pressure on the brain. And way back when, they would get a stone tool out and just kind of start carving into the brain to remove that piece of it. And again, we know that this is a very old surgery, thousands and thousands of years old. Mm-hmm. And we know that people survive this surgery because they can see evidence of new bone growth around the rim of the hole that they made. In fact, there are some people who survived multiple trepanations. So it's wild to think about. They were doing this form of surgery thousands of years ago, a very foolhardy endeavor, you would think, but they were willing to do it. So I did it not on a human. I did it on a deer head and a pig head at a camp up at Maine that teaches survivalist skills and does some experimental archaeology and stuff like that. And they had made some stone tools for me, a little serrated blade made out of flint, so it looked like it had saw teeth on it, and some obsidian as well. And for maybe the first half hour or so, I was impressed at how good those stone tools were. The obsidian cuts really, really well. They can actually make obsidian blades. The edges of them are sharper than modern steel scalpels that they use in surgery. They are extremely, extremely sharp. The downside of stone tools is that even though they can be very sharp, they dull pretty quickly. After I made the first cut, The teeth on it looked more like gums. They were really worn down and very dull at that point. So the last 2/3 of it was basically a war of attrition. But I eventually got through there and got to see the deer brain inside it. And it was kind of a magical moment when I finally got it out of there and felt like I had sort of done this surgery.
Well, let's talk about some of the other things you did. And then later on, we can talk about what you learned and what we can all learn, perhaps, from experimental archaeology. Each chapter of the book zooms in on a particular ancient culture and a specific period of time. And so you start in Africa 75,000 years ago, you end up in Mexico about 500 years ago, and in between, you're in Turkey, Egypt, Viking Europe. How did you plan this itinerary?
It was partly a function of places I thought sounded cool that I wanted to know more about and write about. And partly it was what people are doing interesting experiments with. So it was kind of a mix of what I wanted to do and then what I found out there were good things that people were doing.
And I think my favorite chapter, I mean, they're all great, but my favorite chapter is Egypt, 2000 BC. Mm-hmm. And I love this one because it really puts the rogue in your subtitle, quote, how rogue archaeologists are recreating the sights, sounds, smells, and tastes of lost civilizations. And give me a minute just to set this up for listeners. The pyramids. They're one of the 7 wonders of the world for a reason, right? The largest, and I'm quoting you here, covers an area of 10 football fields and once stood taller than a 48-story building. Its 2.3 million blocks weigh 5,000 pounds on average, with the heaviest weighing 36,000 pounds. Given its construction time of 20 years, crews would have needed to slot a new block into place every 5 minutes, day and night, for 2 straight decades, and with such precision that in many cases, you couldn't slip a knife blade between adjacent blocks. And yet, archaeologists have no idea how they built these darn things, right? And this is where the rogue archaeologist comes in, the experimental archaeologist. There's a guy down in Mississippi. He thinks he may have found the answer. His name is Roger Larson. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so he is an amateur. He is not a credentialed archaeologist. By trade, he is a carpenter, and he ran an alternative newspaper in his hometown of Columbus, Mississippi. But he got sort of obsessed with Egyptology and the pyramids, and he wanted to know how they were built. Mm-hmm. And as you said, we don't know how they were built. It's a bit of an embarrassment for archaeologists that they don't know this basic thing about one of the most studied and best known cultures and most beloved cultures of ancient times. So Roger Larson started looking into it, batting around some theories, but sort of like based on his practical experience as a carpenter, someone who builds things and makes things, he just realized that some of the ideas they were putting out there just didn't make sense. The 2 big ideas people have are that they built a big ramp and they were pushing blocks up the ramp, maybe on log rollers. And Larson didn't do this experiment, but other people have tried pushing these multi-thousand-pound blocks on log rollers. And however good log rollers look on paper, they are very poor in practice. They do not work very well.
I mean, anyone who's tried to wheel like a cart on the beach knows how difficult it is to push anything that's circular with weight on top of it in sand.
In sand, yes. And that's using a modern wheel that's milled to a nice precision, as opposed to a log where you have to shape it. And with wheels, you don't have to take the log it back, run it up to the front, and have a continuous surface to roll over.
While holding the 36,000-pound block so it doesn't come rolling back on you.
Yeah. So rollers we don't think probably worked. It just seems too difficult, all the logistics. Ramps, though, have another problem, which is that if you look at the volume of material you would need to build a ramp at any sort of reasonable grade and get it all the way to the very tippity top of the pyramid, the volume you would need to build a ramp that big exceeds the volume of the pyramid itself by 4 or 5 times. And that's what Roger Larson showed when I went to his shop in Mississippi. He had built a scale model of the largest pyramid, and he had a bunch of sand there. And we basically built a ramp, a scale ramp, and we measured the volume of sand it took to get to the top of the pyramid. And again, it was about 4 or 5 times the volume of the pyramid. And no one else had really done an experiment like this, sort of a just simple experiment to show something like this. So even though he's not credentialed, I thought, oh, it's a very cool idea. The problem, though, is that because he's not credentialed, he's had a lot of trouble getting a hearing for his idea because and there's some understandable reasons for this. There are a lot of people out there who have very kooky ideas about how the pyramids were built, the Graham Hitchcock kind of things, or aliens built them, stuff like that. So it's kind of easier for credentialed archaeologists to just dismiss anyone who does not have their credentials, who isn't in academia. But I think in doing that, in setting up that filter, they miss people like Larson, who I think have some good ideas.
And Larson has, I think, a pretty compelling theory of what the Egyptians actually did to build the pyramids, right? That it's not a ramp, but it's some sort of intricate contraption that he has sort of jury-rigged a version of himself. Describe that.
So after we did this little test run in his shop with the pyramids in the sand, he took me out to a quarry outside town where he had built what he called the pyramid machine. And you can kind of see pictures of it in the book. But basically, it's 2 A-frames, and then there's a bunch of ropes and ratchets in the middle. And then sticking out from the A-frames, there are 2 beams, trees essentially, and they're used as levers. So he built a set of stairs, and you would basically get a bunch of people and you push the levers down, and then inside the A-frame, the ratchet moves, the ropes pull it up. But he had built on the side of the quarry a sledge made of wood, and they had attached a multi-thousand-pound block to this sledge. And by pushing those big tree beam levers down, they were able to raise this multi-thousand-pound block up the side of the quarry just by using tools and materials that were available to the ancient Egyptians. And he will admit, he doesn't know that this is the exact type of machine that they would have used. But he showed it's at least plausible to use the type of materials they had and the technologies they had to move a big block like that up a fairly steep hill.
We may not know exactly how the pyramids were built, but we know what the builders ate and drank while they were building the pyramids. They ate an ungodly amount of bread and they drank an astonishing amount of beer. And thanks to this guy named Seamus Blackley, who's a computer programmer who now moonlights as a, quote, gastro-Egyptologist, you, Sam, know what that Egyptian bread tasted like.
Yeah, to cut to the chase, this was the most delicious bread I've ever had in my life. It was absolutely incredible. And Blackley himself has kind of an interesting backstory in that he actually invented the Xbox gaming system. That is sort of his claim to fame before he went on to do other things, including in his spare time, he makes bread. And I think it's a really good example of what experimental archaeology can do and its limitations and its good things. Because initially, he decided to make some Egyptian bread. He went on Twitter, posted some pictures, and he got a lot of negative feedback. A lot of people said, "You are full of crap. That's not authentic at all. What are you doing?" And instead of getting mad or defensive about it, he said, "You know what? They're right. I didn't know what I was doing. And instead of firing back at them, I'm going to reach out to some people who criticized me, some Egyptologists, some microbiologists, and enlist them and get their help and actually do things right." So he flew over to Egypt with some microbiology equipment, and he sampled the insides of some bread molds there, some authentic bread molds, to get the yeast that they would have used, and then reconstituted it. Then he sourced some heirloom grain, the emmer, it's a type of grain they would have used in their bread. He sourced the type of wood they would have used in their fire pits to cook the bread. He had some people make authentic molds for him that they would have used to cook the bread. He built a fire pit in his backyard. He went all out to make this bread. And I traveled to Los Angeles to try some of this bread. And again, it was the most delicious bread I've ever had in my life. It was a sourdough type and sort of a whole wheat sourdough with the emmer in there. So it tasted different than wheat. And there was coriander in there that came in at the end and sort of tickled my tongue. I am convinced that any bistro in Paris or New York serving this bread, it would be a huge hit. So that was a nice lesson of how to do experimental archaeology poorly, the way he did it at first, and then how to do it properly the way he did it the second time.
Also a lesson, something that's occurring to me as you're talking, is that one of the themes of this book, or one of the things this book is really about, is obsession, right? I mean,
oh, definitely.
These people are a little bit obsessive, aren't they?
They are, yeah. I mean, I think even, regular academia, it sort of lends itself to being a little obsessive. But what's fun about these people is they're doing it in their spare time. And they're doing it just because they love it. And that's part of the fun for me, was talking to these people. Even when I thought they were maybe wrong or a little bit off, they got me thinking about things a new way. They got me asking different questions. And the questions that they have are still kind of bouncing around in my mind.
What are some of those questions? Maybe not just specific to a time and a place, but were there sort of bigger philosophical questions that you came away with?
It really got me to appreciate how sophisticated some of the technologies were back then. I think we have a bit of a narrow idea nowadays of what technology is. We think about electronic gizmos usually as technology, whereas back then, they didn't have electronics, obviously, but technology was a much wider field to them. And I think they had a lot better ideas about practical physics, practical chemistry, and even about nature. They were much better naturalists than we are nowadays. So there are obviously things that we know that they didn't back then, but they knew a lot of things that we just have lost track of nowadays, or most of us have.
Well, I would be down to try Egyptian bread and Egyptian beer, which one archaeologist estimates that it took about 231 million gallons of beer to build the pyramids, which is astonishing.
Yes.
So I would be down to try those staples. I'm not sure I would be up for learning the art of mummification, but this is something that you did with a dead fish in your own house. Tell us that story.
Yeah, so one thing I didn't realize going into the book was that, we all know about the human mummies that the Egyptians made, but they made a lot of animal mummies too. And in fact, there are a few grave sites they have found where they found something like 4 million dogs and millions of ibises, these birds. So they were making mummies on gigantic scales there. And essentially, people were making these animal mummies as votive offerings to their gods. There was a big demand for them. And I thought, well, that's cool. I want to try to make a mummy. And so I talked to a woman. She's an Egyptologist. She lives in Egypt, works there. And she told me that an easy animal to make a mummy out of is a fish, because you can get a whole fish pretty easily. And so I went down to the local store, got a whole fish, a snapper, and I made a mummy out of it. And it was a lot easier than I expected, actually. It was not a very hard process at all. The first step is you got to clean it. So you got to get the guts out from inside it. But beyond that, the only thing you really need to do is use the drying agent that the Egyptians did, which is a mineral called natron. And it's a natural mineral. It forms in wadis there, so dry gullies and riverbeds. And it's essentially just a mix of baking soda and salt. And so what I did is went to the store as the time I got the fish, got a bunch of baking soda and salt, and I mixed them together to make a paste. And then I cooked that in my oven to make it nice and crusty. Then I went and ground it up, and then essentially just put a layer of that down in a casserole dish, put the fish on top of it, packed some natron inside the fish, and then dumped a whole bunch more on top of the fish and just let it sit there. And that's all I had to do. And I live in Washington, D.C., and if you've ever been in Washington, D.C. in the summer, you probably know it's pretty nasty, pretty hot there. And fish are not known for lasting very long. In fact, sort of the opposite. They are an animal notorious for going bad quickly and smelling bad. But I did this experiment in the summer, and this fish never saw the inside of a refrigerator, and it preserved perfectly well. I still have it on my counter today. It's wrapped up, but it's still there. I take it out every once in a while and look at it, and it is perfectly well preserved. It's sort of eerie how well you can preserve flesh with something as simple as just baking soda and salt.
And what's your long-term plan for this? Is it just something that's fun to take out at dinner parties? What's the...
Yeah, just a little knick-knack I have on my shelf. I do need a bit of a long-term plan, though, because honestly, that fish will probably look a lot better than I will in 100 years. I mean, that fish is going to be perfectly fine, whereas I probably won't then. So I do need a long-term plan for it.
Yeah, you need to put the fish in your will. We need to figure out who will be inheriting that fish.
The next generation, yeah.
So I have to say, I'm impressed with you for doing that. I would not have the stomach to do that. And among other things you did in the book for which I would not have the stomach, you mentioned this one earlier, tanning deer hide, which requires mashing goat brains until they are the consistency of, quote, creamy yellow hollandaise sauce, and then massaging that brain aioli into the animal hide. I'm just going to ask you again, are you sure that you loved every second of writing this book?
I was learning something, which is always fun. I'll be diplomatic about it. But no, this was one of the processes where I got sort of frustrated and I thought, oh my God, I cannot believe that people would go through this. Yeah, so essentially what you do to tan a hide is you need to take the skin, the hide of it. There's some treatments before that, scraping off different layers of skin and hair and all that. But eventually you get to the point where you need to work something into the hide to preserve it. Because if you don't do that, it's going to turn into rawhide, which is pretty rough, not going to be comfortable for clothing.
This is like what dogs chew on, right?
Exactly, exactly, yeah. You're not going to want to wear that. So you have to work something in there to preserve the suppleness of the skin. And fats are usually what people have done traditionally to do this. So you take the brain of the animal and you work that into the hide. So I did this at the school I mentioned up in Maine, Moose Ridge there. So we went with goat brains for this.
Okay.
And essentially you just massage them into this hide. Work them with your hands, squish it in there, really, really just grind it in there. You have to wring it out again. Then you just keep going back and doing this for hours and hours and hours.
And the final result, do you have the hide?
I do not have the hide. Part of the deal was I would do the work and they got to keep the hide, but they were the ones who supplied the hide for me. But I did get to see the final process after we had smoked it. That's kind of a final step you do for preservation. You smoke it. And it was amazingly soft. It was one of the softest claws I've ever felt in my life. And to think that I had taken this smelly, bloody thing and to turn that into something that was just like something you would swaddle a baby in, essentially. Like, it was just amazingly soft. And to know that I had done that with my own hands was a pretty amazing experience.
Yeah, the pride of accomplishment and also the lesson that sometimes the old ways are the best ways.
Yeah.
I tip my hat to you. I don't know that I will be tanning any hides in the near future, but there was one section in the book when I was legitimately jealous.
Okay.
And that is when you flew to England, put on a tuxedo, and attended dinner at something called the Buckland Club. What is the Buckland Club? And what was Sam doing there? The answer's when we come back. Welcome back to the show. Sam Kean, author of the new book, Dinner with King Tut, is about to describe the section of the book that filled me with jealousy.
So the Buckland Club is basically a group of people who like to eat strange and unusual foods. So every time they have a theme for the dinner, a different cuisine from somewhere around the world, and they just try a bunch of odd dishes. So they have had badger ham before in their past. They had horse d'oeuvres one year, which not everyone enjoyed. They had an Elvis-themed party once where they had squirrel and other foods like that. And I got to attend the Roman banquet that they put on and got to not only eat the food, but kind of be behind the scenes with the chef archaeologist who was putting on the dinner and acting as their advisor for this Roman banquet.
Describe the food, because one of the misconceptions I think someone might have when they hear a Roman feast is they think, oh, well, you guys are making maybe some pasta with ancient grains or some pizza, using a traditional wood-fired oven or something. Those were not on the menu, were they?
No, the Romans didn't really eat pasta in the sense we think of nowadays. And tomatoes are a New World vegetable. So there were no tomatoes in Roman times. Those are the two things we think about with Italian food nowadays, but they were not an option for the Romans. One ingredient, though, we know that they used in massive quantities was a sauce called garum. And often this is translated, or has been in the past at least, as rotten fish sauce. That is the term that often comes up, as if they were just letting fish rot and then sort of like squeezing them out and drinking these putrid juices. It's probably better translated as fermented fish sauce, which still might not sound that appetizing, but it's essentially a less salty version of Thai fish sauce.
Right.
And the Romans used this on everything, every single dish almost we had that night. had this garum fish sauce in it, including the dessert that we had. But it really had a nice kind of kick to it. And it really was a pretty tasty condiment or sauce that they would put on things.
Yeah, I mean, it sounded like this whole meal was legitimately scrumptious.
Yeah, it was. There were a few things that... So I'm nominally a vegetarian, so some of these dishes were a little off-putting to me, like the kidney that they served wrapped in its own fat.
Yeah, I think you described it as being urine-y.
There was a urine-y tang to it, definitely. Yeah. I could definitely get hints of that to it.
Hints of urine.
Hints of urine, yes. Just a little bouquet of urine in there with the kidney. But even that wasn't so bad. I will say the other dishes were better, I thought. There was a ginger pea. It was almost like a puck of peas with ginger sauce on it and garum, of course. But those were really, really good. I posted the menu online on my website, and you can go to the Buckland Club and see the menu. But there were some dishes in there that I was surprised at how tasty they were.
Oh, that sounds great. We'll have to link to that in the episode notes. Sticking with the Romans for a second, reading the book, I kept having this experience, Sam, where, in one paragraph, I'd be thinking, oh my gosh, our ancestors were just brilliant. And then the next paragraph, I would be thinking, oh my gosh, our ancestors were really weird. And so, like, for example, I would read that the Romans built 53,000 miles of road, which is 6,000 more than the entire U.S. interstate system. I mean, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would read a few pages later that in the public bathrooms in Rome, people would wipe themselves with a communal sponge. Less impressive, I would say. Or I'd read a breathtaking list of all the inventions that came out of ancient China. So paper, printing, cast iron, the compass, rudders, saddles, trousers, suspension bridges, wheelbarrows. It goes on and on and on. And then I'd read that in ancient China, they castrated 100,000 boys, and that some of these eunuchs carried their pickled sex organs with them all the time so that if death struck unexpectedly, they could be reunited with their dismembered privates in the afterlife. Did you have this experience going to these places, writing this book, researching these things, of struggling to reconcile our ancestors' ingenuity with practices that through modern eyes just look pretty strange?
Yeah, there is a bit of a disconnect where they do feel very modern in some ways, where you think, wow, that's really ingenious, or you just recognize them as human. And then you read about things, like you said, like the eunuchs or the communal sponge in the bathroom, and you think, oh my God, like I cannot imagine having to do that. So yeah, there was kind of this disconnect, but it made you appreciate the differences, I think, between different cultures and the fact that human beings are very adaptable, sometimes to the point where it's a maladaptation. Things like, castration are not good, but it's fascinating to read about and to learn about and to just see the sheer variety of human culture throughout history.
Some of the ancient practices that come up in the book are surprisingly relevant to modern life. And I'm thinking specifically of this field of ancient biotics. This is super fascinating. Tell us about ancient biotics.
So ancient biotics is essentially using ancient medical recipes to try to treat drug-resistant strains of bacteria in modern times. And this story dates back to two professors in England. One of them was a professor of Viking studies, which is a great job title to have.
Oh my gosh, such a cool LinkedIn.
Yeah. And the other one was a microbiologist. The Viking studies professor was studying what's called a leech book. Leech being ye old slang for a doctor. A leech book was essentially a list of recipes that doctors in medieval times would use as medicines.
Okay.
And some of them were obvious nonsense that you see in these leech books, like a virgin gathering water from an eastward flowing spring will cure a heart ailment, supposedly. Probably not going to work. That's one of those moments where you're like, they were a little odd. They had some odd ideas in the past, like you said. But there was another one they read about that involved mixing onions, garlic, wine, and the bile of an ox. So from the liver of an ox, you get the bile, the juice out of there. Mix them together in a copper bowl, and that supposedly treats infections of the eye. And they thought, well, maybe that one would work because onions and garlic have some antiseptic properties. Wine definitely does because there's alcohol in it.
Mm-hmm.
And thought maybe we should make some of this up and try it out. So they did, and the microbiologist tried it out in her lab on drug-resistant staph and drug-resistant gonorrhea. And to her delight and surprise, it was very, very effective on both of those bacteria, something that modern pharmaceuticals struggle to kill because of their drug resistance. This medieval recipe from this leech book blasted right through them and killed them. And so she was very delighted about that. And in fact, things went even farther because she happens to be an expert in what are called biofilms. So sometimes in the body, bacteria, they sort of link arms and they secrete a film that blocks pharmaceuticals from actually reaching them. It's a protective barrier of kind of goop and slime they put around themselves that prevents drugs from getting in. And a lot of times, a drug that looks really great in the lab, that works in test tubes, won't work in living beings because the biofilms block the drugs. It can be an obstacle for drugs. But she found that this mix of onion, garlic, wine, and oxgall actually blasted through the biofilms as well and killed these drugs even when they had formed biofilms. So she was very, very excited about this. And they're actually moving forward with clinical trials to see if this medieval mixture could actually be relevant in fighting drug-resistant strains in modern times.
And Sam, you mixed up a batch of this yourself and gave it a whirl, didn't you?
I did, yes. I got some wine, onion, and garlic from the grocery store. The oxgall was actually not that hard to find because it's an ingredient that modern microbiologists use to stain certain bacteria in their labs. You can actually find it online pretty easily. I was surprised. And then you're supposed to mix it in a copper bowl, which I did not have. So I went to the bank and got some nice shiny pennies and put those in there as kind of a substitute, and then let it seep for 9 days. It was very smelly. I had to very pungent garlic and onion odor. I had to put it in my spare bathroom and let it sit there. Apologies to my neighbors upstairs, but let it sit there for 9 days. Got it out. And then, luckily or not, I had a finger that I had gotten a cut in that got infected, and I had a root canal that week as well. And the dentist had told me I should gargle with some Listerine or something in order to prevent infections. But I thought, wait a second, I have this ancient salve that they used. I could try that out instead to fight the infection. So I first soaked my finger in the salve. And then I was like, I probably should have gargled with it first before I put my infected finger in there. But I was like, well, I'm committed to the bit here. So I got a little mouthful of it and tried it and swished it around. It had kind of a strong, unusual taste. I wouldn't recommend it, but it wasn't horrible. And, at least anecdotally, the infection went away and nothing ever happened with my tooth. So based on that anecdote and the fact that it was tested in a real microbiology lab, I think there's really something to this stuff.
I like that expression you just used, committed to the bit. That kind of describes your mentality throughout this whole book, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I knew I wasn't going to come out of this book as some sort of hardcore survivalist who could live through winter in Alaska or something, but I knew that I had to try everything out, give it a good shot, and that even when I was flailing around and suffering from these sort of Three Stooges injuries sometimes, that I would learn things about it, and hopefully it would make for an entertaining bits in the book.
Someone described once mountain climbers as, quote, conquerors of the useless, that there is no practical purpose to climbing a mountain. And while there were some incredible things in the book, like ancient biotics that seem to have a lot of relevance to our modern lives, I couldn't help feeling at times that experimental archaeologists are to some extent conquerors of the useless, that the utility or the value of some of what they're doing beyond the thrill and the adventure just doesn't add up to much. Am I being too cynical?
I think the thrill and the adventure can be a worthwhile pursuit in themselves. I think you could flip that around and say, is any archaeology that useful? Maybe not. I mean, maybe the whole field doesn't have a utility, Except again, I think it does get at some of the big questions about human beings, where we came from, how we spread across the earth, how we got to modern times. I think that's not only a fascinating question, but I think you really understand people better if you know where they came from and you understand their deep history. So maybe not utility in the sense that we're thinking about it in modern terms, but if you step back a little bit and just want to understand human beings in general, I think this kind of archaeology and archaeology in general can be useful.
Years ago on this show, we interviewed Tom Vanderbilt about this book that he wrote called Beginners, which is all about the virtues of being an amateur. Something that has always stuck with me from that conversation with Tom is he was talking about how the word dilettante, which today we take to mean as someone who's sort of a superficial dabbler, that originally that word was used to describe someone who did something just purely for delight, which I think is such a better connotation. And I also think that it applies to this world of experimental archaeologists, right? That they want to understand the past, but there's also just a delight seeking, a pleasure seeking, a joy in their approach to conducting these experiments to reanimate ancient history. Do you buy that?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really nice way to put it. An amateur, I think, is another word that has bad connotation sometimes, but it means someone who loves something. They're just doing it because they're passionate about it. So these are amateurs in the best sense of the word. Someone who is willing to do all the work to learn about it. They're just not getting paid for it. They're doing it because they love it. So I think that really captures the spirit and enthusiasm of the field.
The book ends on a bit of a nostalgic, sort of wistful note. You write, increasingly, we live in a world of the ghostly, flickering images, information abstracted to bits. In modern times, you say we've lost something. What have we lost?
I think we've lost a connection to the physical world in some ways, in that we live in a bit of a disposable culture, and a culture where we can just go and buy something that someone else made. And there's certainly some advantages to that because other people are a lot better at making things than I am, for sure. But when you make something, when you have built it yourself, you care about it more. You have put some of yourself into that thing. And it's not disposable. It's not something you're just going to toss away without thinking about it twice. You've really put some of yourself into it, and it means a lot more to it. And I don't want to get too highfalutin, but there's a bit of a spiritual element to it as well when you put yourself into something like that. And that's not a mentality we usually have or think about nowadays. We don't bring that to the items in our lives in the way that people would have back then, when I do think the objects they made meant more to them.
Do you think we can get that back, that pride of making, that connection to the material?
I don't think we're ever going to go back to the way it was before, but even doing a little bit of it can really open your eyes up a little bit and expand your worldview. An easy way to get into it that I talk about in the book that comes up over and over is food. Just trying to make some old food from heirloom grains or something. And even nowadays, when I walk around my neighborhood, I'm used to seeing trees in the neighborhood, but instead of them being just sort of this vague green canopy overhead, now I can see them as potential tools. I can see the acorns that are dropping as potential food. Even seeing rocks underfoot, I can see them as tools now, and they go beyond just vague, pretty nature out there like it's in a photograph or a picture. I feel a little bit more part of it and a little bit more invested in it.
Well, that sounds like a beautiful way to go through the world, to walk down streets. I'd like to emulate some of that, and I guess to do so, I'll have to take on some experimental archaeology tasks for myself. Sam, it's been really fun to talk to you today.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed this.
Sam Keen's new book, Dinner with King Tut, is out now. Pick up a copy wherever you get your books. There's also a link in the episode notes. And as promised, the show notes also have a link to the complete menu of the Roman feast that Sam enjoyed at the Buckland Club in Birmingham, England. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd be flattered if you want to share it with one of your friends. And if you really want to go above and beyond, you can leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you want to support The Next Big Idea and get ad-free versions of the show, occasional bonus content, access to our subscriber-only series, sign up for the Next Big Idea Club Plus in Apple Podcasts. Just find the show on Apple Podcasts and you'll see there's like a link. Today's show was written, edited, all the things by me, Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. Our executive producer is Rufus Griscom. See you next week.